Doctors, what patients almost passed away from ignoring your advice? 6 years ago, we had a female patient in her late 20s who wanted to have a dental implant done on her. We told her she needed a sinus lift to accept the implant, and we had 2 systems to do it, keyhole and window, and urged her to consider since we couldn't perforate the sinus membrane with the implant, but she kept saying no to it even after we explained everything to her, and even gave her discounts to convince her. We thought she must be thinking that we were going to use the bone from her hip, but we used a deproteinized allograft and synthetic bone back then, but she insisted. We decided to get some help from our lawyer and the dental association, and they recommended using a waiver of responsibility. We had it done by the lawyer, and on the day of surgery, we asked the patient to sign the document before we started, and she got annoyed with us, saying that she doesn't need to sign anything. At this point, she already signed the general consent form and implant consent to dental care, but we said that we needed her to sign to perform this procedure against her best interests, and that if any problems arose in the future, we would still help but are not liable in any way, shape, or form. After a bit, she ended up signing the document and even took a picture of it, and we had the surgery done. It was just 1 implant, so it was a 30-minute job for us. Most implantologists can take up to 2 to 3 hours or just 1. It was a successful operation, and initial stability was achieved with no perforation of the sinus membrane. A healing cap was placed on it to prevent her from playing with it, and she was required to take antibiotics for 2 weeks as well as maintain her dental hygiene and return in 6 months for her abutment and crown, which she decided to pay in advance. A month later, she called us up and said she was having a throbbing sensation on her cheek, which would either mean a punched nerve or vein or a serious infection. We prescribed amoxicillin to her, which is some strong stuff, so this should have never happened. We decided to change the prescription and have it sent to her by email since she was abroad. 2 months later, she called back and said that her implant fell off and she's intending to sue. The failure site indicated peri-implantitis as the cause, but it should have ceased by now. We started to get suspicious, so we go to the dental association involved. We offered to treat her for free and replace the implant for free as well as rebuild for free. But she didn't reply, and instead of suing, she went quiet and didn't reply until 3 months after her scheduled appointment. She called back, crying after she heard the news from her ophthalmologist that she was at risk of going blind in one eye. Other physicians say she had trauma along all the major nerves on one side of her face, affecting her nasal and optical sinuses, and possibly even in the lower parts of her brain. She admitted to us that she never bought any of the prescriptions and didn't fly back because she was being too cheap, and she regretted all of it. She couldn't stop crying over the phone, and we wanted to help her, but she hung up and we couldn't call back. We don't know what happened to her, but we hope to this day that she's okay. This is the first and only unconfirmed incidents we've had in over 36 years of dentistry. Story 2. Not necessarily the patient, but there's caretakers at the facility where the patient was living. I used to visit different board and lodge facilities for adults with mental illnesses and meet with clients to discuss their mental health, help them set up job interviews and therapy sessions, and help them set up their medications for the week if they were unable to do it themselves. Most of these facilities were places for people who had left the hospital or were deemed independent and stable enough to have the freedom to come and go as they pleased in a shared living situation, much like a dorm. Despite having a place and food provided, they were usually pretty poorly supervised by the mental health staff there. I often hated these places because, while they were ideal for some people who were truly getting back on their feet and thrived off being able to live a semi-normal independent life, they were way too lax for many of the sicker, more isolating patients who were not at all well and slipping under the radar. Some of this included them not taking their medication as directed, which was one of the requirements for keeping their housing, but unfortunately, it was not strictly enforced. There was one man who had paranoid schizophrenia who was extremely quiet and kept to himself. I had met with him a few times, and he seemed to be going downhill in his appearance and general mood. I spoke with his doctor and urged the facility staff to closely monitor him and his medication intake, as I saw in his logs that he often skipped coming in to get his medication at all. I was told that they were going to be sitting down with him to remind him of his living agreement and that he had 30 days before losing his housing if he wasn't medically compliant. I was also told that his psychiatrist was aware and that they may be sending him back to the hospital that week. Apparently this never happened and he went out into the community with bad intentions towards his roommate. The roommate survived, but the man who had gone off his medication claimed his roommate was out to get him, which urged him to get even. For anyone with a horrible incident like that on their medical report, it is incredibly unlikely that he will ever be able to find a better rehabilitation house that will accept him. The system basically screwed over 2 people that day, as the man who was hurt was already there for PTSD, so it exacerbated the illness with more trauma. That's just heartbreaking. I mean, he was totally preventable. Story 3. This is not about a patient, but it's about a patient's family member. I had a patient in the ICU for some respiratory issue I can't even really remember now. He had chronic pain and some mental health issues at baseline, and he had this codependent girlfriend who was a very nice lady but who was very present at his bedside all the time. Constantly bedside herself with worry that he wasn't getting enough pain medication, he was, and that he wasn't getting enough sleep. He wasn't, but nobody does in the ICU. We kept reassuring her that we were giving him his meds and not to worry. The day he transferred out of the ICU, I was working a night shift and he heard a code blue paged overhead. It was for him. He was fortunately found right away, intubated, and came right back to my ICU. After some digging and after he was able to wake up and give us some info, we found out that his girlfriend was worried he wasn't going to be able to sleep. So she brought some Seroquel, a schizophrenia medication on the street, and gave it to him. And his dumb self took it. He was already in his home dose of Seroquel and opioids, plus some additional opioids for the acute pain of whatever was going on with him. The sedation from that extra Seroquel in conjunction with the rest of his meds tipped his already not-so-great respiratory issues into full flare-ups. Once he woke up, he was mortified and asked that she not be allowed to visit him anymore. I had to call her and tell her she was not allowed to visit him anymore and that hospital security had been alerted. She was not happy. The lesson: if someone is hospitalized, we will provide the appropriate medications. You do not need to bring in extra meds you bought on the street. We got it. Story 4. I had a repeat patient, not quite frequent flyer status, as a medic who would always call for a severe allergic reaction to shellfish every other month or so. She had always had an allergy and knew her reactions were getting worse. After a year, 6 or 7 calls of this silliness, my crew and I stayed in the hospital ER with her and talked at length about the situation since she'd always stayed mum about how it kept happening. She told us she comes from a patriarchal culture and her father made this amazing seafood soup. If she didn't eat it, since it's his gift to the family, she would lose her car, phone, or whatever discipline her father deemed necessary. We pleaded with her to do whatever it took to show him it was dangerous and carry her EpiPens with her. Fast forward a few years to when I altered my course into nursing and joined that ER, and I saw a familiar, bloated face. It turns out she had gone off to college in another state and hadn't been home for a while, but had visited her folks for a holiday. Of course, she had the soup, and despite using the EpiPen when her symptoms started, the reaction continued. Her mom, who had never seen before, told me she tried to eat it fast and rushed to the bathroom. Medics tried medical management until they could drive her to her ER. Doc performed a tracheotomy at the bedside and she went to the ICU. It took a week for her to recover, and I was told by the ICU nurses that her father finally got it and that her allergy was a real medical condition. Oh, so now you get it, Dad. Story 5. Me. I wasn't on the brink yet, but I was very, very sick. I went for a mini vacation in Batam, Indonesia, where a villa had a private pool. Throughout a 48-hour stay, I spent more time in the water than out. When I wasn't in the water, I was in our air-conditioned villa room. In the day, it was blazing hot, and at night, it was super windy because it was near the sea. I'm also asthmatic. While it's mostly under control, I usually get a tight chest feeling when I'm ill and haven't had a full flare-up in years. I felt sick after the trip, high fever, runny nose, cough. I'm also a healthcare professional. I studied life sciences and diagnostic testing. I'm hardly bothered and can take care of myself when I get sick. Eventually, the fever went away and I was left with a cough. The week after the vacation, I was still having a cough, and we went to play paintball. I completely overexerted myself, running, ducking, crawling, what have you. After the game, we went to a friend's place to have lunch and chill. I fell asleep but woke up coughing with a feeling of something in my respiratory tract. I thought it was phlegm. I went to the bathroom to cough it out, but nothing was happening. I lost track of time and my friends asked if I was alright, and I just kept saying, "Yeah, it's just a cough. I think there's some phlegm stuck and I'm trying to get it out." I finally went to see the doctor, my regular GP, the next day. It turns out I was having a very serious asthma flare-up. I just couldn't recognize it because I haven't had one in many years. The worst thing is that this was the same doctor who told me to always carry my inhaler around just in case, but I just wasn't diligent about it. Until now, my friends would yell, "It's just a cough, I'm fine," whenever I made even the smallest cough or sneeze. Now that I think about it, I was almost on the brink. Story 6. It happened so often it was almost a non-issue. We would basically just shrug our shoulders and say, "Welp." Number 1, I had a patient who kept adjusting her insulin dosage against my advice because she was terrified of having her feet affected like her mom. So she had several occasions of dangerously low blood sugar, one of which put her in the ICU. 2, I had a lady who had the opposite problem. Raging diabetes but was in deep denial so she would never take her insulin. She was in the ICU multiple times for diabetic ketoacidosis. Number 3, I had a ton of patients on dialysis who skipped dialysis for whatever reason. Didn't feel like going, had a flight with a boyfriend who was her ride, took a vacation to a city without a dialysis unit, etc. So they would come in with their electrolytes all messed up and have to get emergency dialysis inpatient. Number 4, I had a billion men with chest pain for weeks who refused to come into the hospital to be evaluated for cardiovascular issues and either passed away at home or came back a week later with extensive MIs. Number 5, half of my patients with COPD still smoke despite my exhortations. One had marks on his body from the last time he smoked around his O2 tank. Number 6, I had patients take extra doses of benzodiazepines and end up in the hospital. Story 7. My granddad is the patient. Come straight back if you have any chest pain, the doctor said. He didn't go back and a series of multiple medical issues followed. He began as a man nearing his 80s who was old school. He worked as a school crossing guard, grew all of his own vegetables, fed the birds, built tables, biked 6 miles on the weekends, walked everywhere, and was still able to play darts despite his failing eyesight because he knew the board so well. He went from that to living in a care home and was unable to talk. Has he lost his stubbornness? Nope. He won't do his rehabilitation, and so even though he could get his speech back to a decent degree, he doesn't want to do the therapy, and using communication cards embarrasses him. So we're left trying to decipher random eyebrow movements so we can guess what he's trying to say. One of these days, I'm going to talk to him until things make sense. Him and his brothers. They're all the same. My uncle, granddad's younger brother, didn't go to the hospital at all and was found with more issues after another. Goes to show that it's always a good reminder to listen to the professionals. Hey, while we're already in the middle, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. It helps the channel grow, and we've got more fascinating stories on the way. Stay tuned. Story 8. I was the assistant manager of a group home. We had a resident who had epilepsy and was also very reclusive. He would get agitated if we came into his room or even knocked on the door. However, the policy said he had to be checked every 30 minutes because of his risk. That wasn't being done, so I brought this up with the manager. She said she was aware, but it was okay to bend the rules because he would get really upset when we checked in on him. I really wasn't comfortable with her answer, but I was young and assumed she knew better than me. When I was on duty, I checked on him every 30 minutes and he would yell at me, but I didn't let it bother me. About 6 months later, after I had been reassigned to another group home, he had a seizure alone in his room and passed away. Just a day later. Now I'm older and a little smarter. When I find a problem like this, I stick with it and don't let people talk me out of it. Not again. Story 9. Once I was the only doctor on duty in a rural village with diminished medical supplies. The village is called Shinafia and lies in the desert of southern Iraq. A young child came to what was supposed to be an ER with a sick tummy and some dehydration. They didn't have tap water and they drank from a nearby river. Directly, that is. From what I gathered, it seemed that the child had cholera, which has a unique reputation in medicine. I strongly urged his father to keep him longer for observation, but he refused. A few hours later, he came back and the child was very ill and dehydrated. He was, as we describe such a case medically, drowsy. I couldn't get IV access and didn't have a central line set. I had to cannulate one of the large veins. Cholera wasn't endemic, not usually seen there, so I had to make some calls, provide some samples to be tested about 200 miles away, and send the child to an ambulance after he was stable. The father and his son came back a couple of weeks later to visit. I gave him some chlorine tablets and cookies for the kids. Story 10. Hi, doctor here. I had a patient who came in and on evaluation had determined that her diabetes was out of control by the looks of her retinas, which required immediate intervention. I sent her straight to the retina specialist, who then scheduled her for an OR. She decided that day not to go in because she had work and couldn't afford to take off. She was cleaning houses and the sprays made her sneeze, affecting her eyes due to the weakened vascular state from the diabetes. She went immediately blind and got emergency surgery that day. It took months of recovery to reverse some damage, and she, now, years later, has functional vision again. Her kidneys were also failing her and she had no idea. This kicked off a massive lifestyle change and a chain of doctor appointments that saved her life, all starting with an eye exam. Modern medicine thankfully saved her. But the decision she made was objectively the wrong one. You can't make much money blind either. Hindsight, however, is 20/20. Remember what they say about the eyes being the windows to the soul? Yeah. Story 11. I am a psychotherapist who has worked extensively with patients with dependencies. Most of them don't take the advice to quit their substance of choice, but one particular case comes to mind. I worked at an inpatient behavioral health hospital during the time I treated this patient with drinking problems. We would treat him with a detox, therapy, and medications and provide him with resources once he was discharged. We would do this at every admission, which was approximately once per month over the course of the 4 years that I worked there. We tried our best to support and help with whatever we had. We didn't just tell him to stop and then go on our way. Plus, not only did I impress upon him how important it was for him to stop drinking, but so did his psychiatrist and PCP. His PCP eventually fired him as a patient because he wouldn't listen. The guy's organs were failing and he was on the brink. He lived longer than any of us expected him to, but he finally passed last year because of the damage. Story 12. Not a doctor or in the medical field, but my dad does this all the time. The funniest story is after he got out of the hospital for having an electrostimulator for pain management. He's also a recipient of a liver transplant, which makes him immunocompromised. When he got home, he saw that his pecan trees hadn't been pruned. So after getting settled, he breaks out with his ladder, ties a rope to the handle of his chainsaw, throws it over his shoulder, and shimmies up his trees. When my older brother, who was a nurse, got home, he heard the chainsaw and went to see if he could help, thinking the old man was just chopping up some already down timber. When he saw where he was and what he was doing, he yelled at the old man to get out of the tree. About that time, my old man took a step to climb higher and put his foot in a dry branch. Needless to say, due to his immunocompromised status, they couldn't operate, so he just had to let his ankles heal. Story 13. The patient came in and was discovered to have problems in his abdomen and needed surgery. Doc was in the middle of another surgery and the patient's vitals were good, so we monitored her and told her she would go up as soon as he was finished. 2 hours later, OR sent for the patient and she refused. She stated that if Doc can make her wait, he can wait. She wanted to have dinner and go to bed. Nothing worked to change her mind. After several rounds of doctors and nurses educating, begging, etc., the surgeon came down to see what was going on. After speaking with her for a while, he came out of the room and said, "Keep monitoring and don't feed. She'll come around one way or another." Several hours later, I was taking a set of vitals and talking with the patient when she just fizzled out in the middle of a sentence. Luckily, she came back right away. Immediately after she felt a little better, the patient apologized profusely and signed consent. We rushed her to the OR. There was a lot more stubbornness and cursing on the part of the patient, but she wanted to keep it short. It just boggles my mind that she did that out of spite. Story 14. I had a patient signed out by another ER doctor at shift change pending a chest x-ray. CXR showed aortic dissection. We can't believe this guy's still alive. Being a small hospital, level 3 trauma center in the middle of nowhere, we called the closest level 1 for a transfer. Ambulance showed up for transfer and the guy decided he's not going. He's got enemies in that city and they'd hunt him down, he said. After a standoff in the ER hallway involving security, police, EMTs, multiple doctors, nurses, and a very scared scribe, me, the guy, a very large man, got on board with the plan and decided not to leave AMA against medical advice. Later, we find out from EMTs that he's tried to jump out of the ambulance en route to the other hospital. Once he arrived, he left AMA. No clue what happened to him after, but damn, the dissection was insane. Yep, NPC activities. So, thanks for hanging out with me today. Stay healthy and don't ignore those warning signs. Oh, and speaking of wild stories, you won't want to miss the next video. Doctors, let me just say, how are you still alive? Story 2's recovery is incredible. See you there.